Just give it a moment to finish loading. Looks like it's all working. Excuse me. Good. Okay. So I just need to move my Zoom pictures into the right corners, and then we can get down to work. Good afternoon to everyone, or whatever time of day it may happen to be when you're watching this, if you're not watching it live. We are going to continue our Rashi and Rambam duo, and we are hitting our double parasha. Now, there is no chance that we're going to get through both Vayakhel and Pekudei. However, we may cover a few more verses as we go through, simply because both Rashi and Rashbam have less to say on this portion than they did in previous ones. Now, why? Quite simply because Vayakhel and Pekudei are a somewhat of a retread. They are the fulfillment of the commands that were given in Truma and Tetzaveh that we've already discussed before, and thus there is some less new material. Now we get some good new material right here at the beginning of Vayakhel, but throughout these two parshiot, we're not getting as much new material. Rather, we're getting the construction, the fulfillment of the material that has already been discussed. As such, they don't expand as much as they did in previous verses. So that's a good word to the wise. If you are looking for a commentator's opinion on a particular aspect of the Mishkan, your first place to look should be when it is first mentioned in the earlier parshiot, rather than here where it is being constructed, unless it is a deviation from what was mentioned earlier, such as the order in which things were put together. But we will cover those topics as we go. And one last interruption from my phone, and one last thing to also learn from the structure of the commentary here in these two parshiot is to not be dismayed by the lack of commentary. Sometimes we are drawn to the juiciest commentary, the most interesting commentary by our own understanding, and that can prejudice us against some of the commentary that may come in more simpler forms, or that are just a bit more terse because there is less commentary needed. However, the commentators here did feel that commentary was still necessary, as we'll see, and as such, we should pay them mind as they try to explain these verses. So let's go ahead, as we always must, and begin with the Torah itself, beginning in chapter 35, verse 1. Now Moshe assembled the entire community of the children of Israel and said to them, "These are the words that Adonai has commanded to do them. For 6 days is work to be made, but on the seventh day there is to be holiness for you, Sabbath ceasing for Adonai. Whoever makes work on it is to be put to death. You are not to let fire burn throughout all your settlements on the Sabbath day." Moshe spoke to the entire community of the children of Israel, saying, "This is the matter that Adonai has commanded, saying, take for yourselves a raised contribution for Adonai. Whoever is willing of willing mind is to bring it, Adonai's contribution." And before we get into that long list, I'm going to stop there to look at our commentary, because you may have noticed there was quite a abrupt topic change from verses 1, 2, and 3, which are talking about Shabbat, and then in particular the issue of fire on Shabbat. And then from 4 onward, we seem to be going right back into the construction instructions for the Mishkan. And, well, obviously that's going to need some commentary, but let's go ahead and take a look at what our sages have to say first. We're going to begin with Rashbam, because he is going to be very straightforward about what is interesting in this first verse of chapter 35, which is that first verb, Vayakhel, that this word here that is being translated as "now Moshe assembled." And you may be wondering, why does that need commentary? Moses assembled. Well, let's look at his commentary, and then we can figure out that perhaps there is more that we needed to think about before we dismiss this as needing an answer. He assembled the people in order to collect the half shekel from all those who were of age. He also warned the people concerning the building of the tabernacle. So what Rashbam is drawing our attention to here is the fact that Vayakhel is not always used when Moses wants to convey information to the people of Israel. That he can also say just, and Moses said to Bnei Israel, or Adonai told Moses to say to the people of Israel. There are multiple other phrases which are far more common than Vayakhel is as an introductory phrase to an encounter between Moses and the people. So the phrasing here demands some explanation. Rashbam is giving us the most in-context, straightforward kind of explanation, which is his technique, which is to say, well, what have we discussed recently that would require this sort of gathering? Well, specifically, we would need a gathering of this nature to fulfill the mitzvah of the half shekel, which was mentioned back in Parashat Ki Tisa. So that half shekel is clearly what must be going on here. Now, that's perfectly fine. As I said, have said many times, Rashbam is trying to read things in the most straightforward manner possible. But as we also discussed, some of the instructions in the book of Exodus have been rearranged according to many of the opinions of the Chachamim, the sages, and thus we shouldn't always feel bound by the chronology of chapters to believe that we know the chronology of the time. But Rashbam is still trying to hold to the simplest explanation if possible, and it is certainly possible to read the Vayakhel here as being the half shekel collection. However, Rashbam himself is also trying to bridge the gap between our first three verses and the rest of this Torah portion, which goes between this gathering, which seems to be entirely about Shabbat, and the rest of it, which seems to be about the Mishkan itself. And he is going to use a very famous, but you may think not straightforward interpretation, which is to say that this gathering, which starts off with the prohibition on fire for Shabbat and the general prohibition of work on Shabbat, seems out of place. And yet our tradition says that juxtaposition was entirely intentional, in order that the people would know that as important as the Mishkan is, it does not supersede the requirement to rest on Shabbat. And so as Moses is gathering the materials through the census taken with the half shekel that is going to be used for the Mishkan's construction, he is also reminding them that, yes, this is important, but Shabbat even more so. So he is using them. You might wonder, well, is that really the Peshat? Is that really the straightforward sense of this chapter? Couldn't we just say, Moses gathered the people and said, be careful about Shabbat and fire? And then Moses also decided to say, and here are some of the things we need for the Mishkan. Why do we have to see this as being connected? And you're right, that is a perfectly reasonable literary discussion of the text. Indeed, many modern academics have tried to argue that there is a cut and paste dynamic throughout the Torah, where the text has been compiled from many different hands and editors and authors. But that is not how we understand it in a traditional community. And it's not how Torah has sustained us throughout the last 3,000 years. Rashbam may be committed to Peshat, but that doesn't mean that he is antagonistic to the information that has been passed down through our tradition. And as our tradition has seen this juxtaposition as being critical for understanding Shabbat, he is perfectly fine in allowing that to guide our reading of the Peshat, of the simple understanding of this passage. After all, why should we default to the idea that this was written by multiple people over multiple centuries that had no inkling of any of the issues of editing and juxtaposition, and that they were somehow blundering through the copying of multiple scrolls into a single narrative without realizing that it would seem a little out of place to suddenly digress into a Shabbat conversation here. Even the worst modern editor would not have put this passage here, but would have put it into more Shabbat concentrated text. But our tradition says, yes, you have to assume a lot of things about the ignorance of ancient editors to end up with this type of juxtaposition. On the other hand, you only have to assume one thing, that a divine author wanted us to have this particular arrangement in order to teach us about Shabbat, for us to assume that this is exactly right and in the place where it is. So Peshat does not always mean rejecting tradition, and it certainly doesn't mean rejecting the midrash, the passed down understanding and interpretation of the text. And again, this really challenges the notion that some communities like to profess about the ability to read the text entirely by itself, that the text is all and the text is self-explanatory. It certainly is not, and this is a great example. Good. With Rashi on one side, with Rashbam on one side, let's take a look at Rashi over here on the other. And from the translation of Rashi, the introductory phrase would read, and Moses assembled, or gathered, depending upon how you want to have Vayakhel, all the children of Israel on the morrow after the day of atonement, when he came down from the mountain. It, meaning the word Vayakhel, is used in the verbal form that expresses the idea of causing a thing to be done, because one does not actually assemble people with one's hands, but they are assembled by his command. And then he points out some discussion about the Targum, about the Aramaic translation. So we get two very important things here. One, a little grammar, and I know I don't throw a lot of grammar out because I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, and it takes a lot of background information to make sense of it. But here, what he is pointing out is that from the construction of this verb, and Hebrew has multiple ways of constructing verbs, it is in a causative form, meaning that it isn't that Moses himself is doing it with his hands, it is Moses is causing this to transpire. And that may sound strange to articulate in English, but that's because English and Hebrew are different languages. In Hebrew, there is special verb forms for this causative type of construction. So it's just trying to point out that why did we use this particular, what's known as a binyan form of the verb? It is because Moses didn't do it with his hands. He didn't actually, the equivalent would be the difference between writing versus dictating. He didn't write it with his own hands. He dictated it, which meant someone else did it. And here, the verb, he didn't gather or assemble them, meaning pulling each person, dragging them manually. He simply made the assembly happen by asking that it happen. He put out the request and people gathered, therefore the verb is fine. Enough grammar for today. But the first aspect of Rashi's commentary is probably going to be more interesting to a wider audience, which is Rashi is trying to place the Vayakhel passage into the timeline of the narrative so far. And he is fixing it at the day after Yom Kippur. Why would it be Yom Kippur? Well, according to the traditional timeline of the events that took place at Mount Sinai, we reached Mount Sinai at the time of Shavuot, the holiday of Shavuot. And when you do the math and you map it out visually, you can then see that there's good evidence to believe that the sin of the golden calf would have taken place on Tisha B'Av, which is the day of great catastrophe and mourning in our people. And this would have been one of the first acts that would have given that its flavor. And then you have Moses appealing to God by going back up the mountain and returning after that period of time. And it is possible to work out by reading the narrative that return would have been on Yom Kippur. That is to say, it would have been that God accepted our plea for forgiveness, Moses's entreaty on our behalf on Yom Kippur. And so the first Yom Kippur out of Egypt would have been a day when we actually were being forgiven for our transgression, notably the transgression of the golden calf. So he is putting Vayakhel into that same place and saying, okay, so this is now where it is, and this is what is being shared with the community at that time. Okay, so let's go ahead, and Rashi gets also into another aspect of verse 2, which Rashbam does not talk about. And Here we are focusing on Sheshet Yamim, on the 6 days. As you can see, for 6 days is work to be made, or on 6 days will you do work. He intentionally mentioned them he intentionally mentioned to them, the prohibition in reference to the Sabbath before the command about building the tabernacle, in order to intimate that it does not supersede the Shabbat, the Sabbath. So Rashi is making the comment in verse 2 that was implied by the comment of Rashbam in verse 1. So this is another difference between the two authors. Rashi will often drop bits of information as he goes, wherever he feels it is most relevant and appropriate. Rashbam will sometimes gather the information at the beginning of a topic and then not feel the need to repeat that information as he goes. But the idea here between the two of them is the same, that Rashi is saying this is because by putting it here, we are being reminded that the building of the tabernacle is not more important than Shabbat, and we must not work on Shabbat even for the building of the tabernacle. Now, excuse me, since sorry. That's the problem with doing these live. I can't edit. I guess I could go back and edit those out, but I couldn't edit them out for the people watching. The discussion then becomes, well, if Rashbam is well aware of Rashi's commentary, it was his grandfather after all, then why does Rashbam feel the need to make a comment in his commentary? After all, he has said in multiple places, and we've even discussed it, that he didn't come to replace his grandfather's commentary, and he wasn't trying to overly criticize his grandfather's commentary. It was simply that he felt that his grandfather had not kept to the Peshat, the straightforward commentary as perhaps as closely as Rashbam would like. And so Rashbam wanted to introduce that closer reading of the Peshat than his grandfather sometimes did. Well, why then is he repeating the same thing here? Well, because that's a double-edged sword. When he is known for wanting to continue with the Peshat, if he chooses not to repeat certain teachings, then it runs the risk of implying to a reader of his commentary that interpretation is not Peshat. So he is hamstrung, if you will. If he doesn't include it, then it implies that it's not Peshat. But if he does include it, then he is repeating something that his grandfather said. And Rashbam will sort of have to ride that balance beam to try and figure out where should he mention it, where should he not mention it if his grandfather already did, in order that he not imply that the commentary of his grandfather on this particular topic was not Peshat. And as we discussed, even though this is officially from a midrash halacha, Rashbam is trying to make sure we understand that not everything found in a midrashic work is midrash in the technical sense of a commentary on the Torah. That many things that are in the midrash, especially in the midrash halakhic collections, should be considered peshat instead. Okay, and now let me just scroll so we can get verse 3 highlighted here. We get to their discussion about verse 3, which is our discussion about fire on Shabbat. So let's go ahead and we'll look at Rashbam first. Seeing that in connection with the festivals, the Torah wrote that work in connection with the preparation of food was permitted on such days, meaning the handling of fire was permitted. Moses had specifically permitted baking and cooking, and the references are there in Exodus 12 and 16. In view of this, the Torah considered it necessary to repeat the prohibition of handling fire on Shabbat. If this kind of work was prohibited on Shabbat, other work, which was far less urgent, was certainly prohibited too. Okay, so there is a question here of why are we being told not to have fire on Shabbat, since we've already been told that before. And his explanation is, well, we have to be told that because we've also already been told that you can have fire on a festival day. And if we feel that we can have fire on a festival day, then we might be inclined to think, well, maybe we could have fire on Shabbat for the needs of the day, meaning for cooking and things like that. So the Torah has to repeat the prohibition of fire on Shabbat in order to rule out that mistaken potential interpretation. It's a very common rhetorical and logical inference that is made throughout the commentaries on the Torah, that many of the passages are written specifically to rule out mistaken ideas that would have occurred if that passage had not been written. And then he draws the logical conclusion that would have been plain to all of the people gathered to Moses just as they were about to begin the Mishkan, which was, again, if you can't use fire for the Mishkan, and if you can't use fire, which is immensely important on Shabbat, because, food and all of that, then certainly all of the other work would be prohibited, both for the Mishkan, and all of the other work for the Mishkan would be prohibited on Shabbat. So we get a beautiful summation of our prohibition of melacha, of work on Shabbat. Now, Rashi is going to go a little bit more technical on this, and you can always sort of tell that something more difficult is happening when you see how short the Rashi's commentary actually is and how long the translation is. Now, does this mean that the translator is doing a bad job? In fact, the translator is doing an excellent job. It's just that the translator is trying to make up for the assumptions that Rashi is making about all of our background knowledge and understanding that Rashi conveys in very few words. But Rashi is speaking to a very familiar audience to himself and to the topic at hand, and the translator wants to make sure that this is understood by a much wider audience. So I'll try to point out where we finish Rashi literally, meaning the actual translation of Rashi, and where the commentator, the translator, picks up with his commentary and explanation. So again, we have a restatement of the verse, you shall not kindle a fire, and goes on, of course, throughout the community, throughout the inhabitations on your Sabbath day. So what does Rashi actually say about that? There are some of our rabbis who say that the law of kindling fire is singled out. That's pretty much it. That's the first half, I should say, right up to here. And what does that mean? That the law of fire is singled out? Well, what does this mean is it goes forth from the general proposition, which needs further explanation. It is specially mentioned here, although it is already included in the do not do work on Shabbat law, in order to constitute it a mere negative commandment, thus indicating that, like all other negative commands, its infringement is punishable by lashes, but does not make the offender liable to death, as does the doing of other work on Shabbat. Okay, so he's pointing out that in the broader discussion in the in Jewish law, and then thankfully bringing all of the citations here at the bottom where this is discussed in much more detail in the Talmud, that there are some of the opinion that because verse 3 specifically mentions the burning of Shabbat, that it is going to have a different standing, that it is going to be different than what was mentioned in verse 2. In verse 2, it just said, don't do any work on Shabbat or the perpetrator will be put to death. And verse 3 said, don't make fire. Well, if making fire is a type of work, then why did I need to be told that when I was just told don't do work in the line before? Well, one interpretation that has logical legs to it is that verse 3 is trying to separate. It is trying to move fire into the category of a negative transgression on Shabbat, and certainly that is something that shouldn't be done, but no longer within the category of work, of melacha, technically, and thus no longer subject to the punishment of death for which the other categories of work would require. And that means that instead it would just be a regular old transgression of a thou shalt not commandment, which, failing to have additional information, we punish with different forms of corporal punishment, of flogging. So because verse 3 comes after the general statement of verse 2, it could be read as really moving the issue of fire away from the general rules about the punishment for behavior on Shabbat. However, and these are going to be our last, 4 words of Rashi, others, however, say that it was singled out to separate the various kinds of work comprised in the term kol melacha, meaning all of the work that we got in the general statement about Shabbat prohibition, thus indicating that each transgression of the Sabbath law is to be atoned for separately, if several of them have been committed at the same time and under the same circumstances. So what this small phrase is trying to say is that by separating it, which is pretty much all that is being said in the Rashi commentary there, is trying to say, by mentioning a specific category that is underneath the phrase of work on Shabbat, the Torah is trying to teach us that each category itself counts as its own transgression. So if you commit an act which transgresses multiple types of work simultaneously, then you are still liable for each category which you are transgressing. So far from moving fire away from the general ruling about work, it is actually using it as a paradigm of work to say that individual types of work, categories of work, the av melachot, are all different enough from each other that an act that violates multiple will require multiple forms of atonement, multiple sacrifices in the ancient world, or multiple teshuvot, repentance from us in the modern. So we're not going to go into the ins and outs of those discussions. That's the reason why there are 5 different texts that are mentioned at the bottom of this commentary. Go and learn it, study. It's always good to see things in more detail. But just a little example of how sometimes the shortest Rashis can introduce some of the most complicated material. But this is not the time for Mishnah or Talmud study on Shabbat work. That's something to do. Well, we're not doing Shabbat at the moment in my Mishnah class, but you can always go back and check the back catalog. Although, actually, now that I think about it, I'm not sure if we were recording when we were doing Shabbat. I'd have to go back and look. Okay, so with that, we are now going to jump into our new category of discussion, which is the building of the Mishkan. We're going to go back into the Torah so I can read a block of it. And let me just roll my commentators into their right spots. And then we'll go back and look at the commentary about it. We already talked about that in 3, 4, and 5. So, and those who are of willing mind to bring it. Again, I really love Fox's translation here, where it uses the phrase libo. He translates as mind, because in modern English, when you use the literal word lev, heart, people immediately think purely emotionally, irrational, that it's not being done with logic. And that's not what our ancestors meant by the word lev. The word heart was a totality of the person's self and how they made decisions and guided themselves in the world. We didn't have the whole heart-mind nonsense that crept into Western philosophy and has contaminated ourselves and our understanding of our own emotional relationships, internal dialogue, all the other things that make it very hard for people to find balance in the modern world. But if you want to bring this, then here's what you can bring for Adonai's contribution: gold, silver, bronze, blue violet, purple, worm scarlet, byssus and goat's hair, ram skin, dyed red, tanned leathered skins, acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for oil of anointing and for fragrant smoking incense, onyx stones and stones for setting for the ephod and for the breastpiece. And anyone wise of mind among you is to come and to make all that Adonai has commanded. The dwelling, its tents and its cover, its clasps and its boards, its running bars, its columns, its sockets, the coffer and its poles, the purgation cover and the curtain for the screen, the table and its poles and all its implements, and the bread of presence, the lechem panim, the lampstand for lighting and its implements and its lamps, and the oil for the lighting, and the altar for the smoke offering and its poles, and the oil for anointing, and for the fragrant smoking incense, and the drawing screen for the entrance of the dwelling, and the altar for offering up, and the bronze lattice that belongs to it, its poles and its implements, the basin and its pedestal, the hangings of the courtyard, its columns and its sockets, the screen for the gate of the courtyard, the pins of the dwelling, and the pins of the courtyard and their cords, the officiating garments for attending at the holy shrine, the garments of holiness for Aaron the priest, the garments for his sons for acting as priest. So the entire community of Israel went out from Moses' presence. And then they came, every man whose mind uplifted him, and everyone whose spirit made him willing brought Adonai's contribution for the skilled work of the tent of appointment, for all its service of the construction, and for the garments of holiness. Then came men and women alike, everyone of willing mind they brought, brooch and nose rings and signet rings and necklace, every kind of gold object, everyone who wished to elevate an elevation offering of gold to Adonai. We're going to pause there because we've gone quite a ways without our commentary, but if you look over in Rashbam, you'll notice that there are not comments on each verse, and that is very indicative, as I mentioned, of the fact that he has covered anything that he felt needed to be covered in previous chapters. Let's just roll back so we can go through these with Rashi more than him in their correct place. There we go. Oh, no, sorry. So we get the beginning here where it says that Moses spoke to the entire community saying, this is the matter that Adonai has commanded you. Well, the thing is, it doesn't actually say who was commanded, that there is an implied pronoun there, but Rashi wants to make it explicit, which is that God has commanded me, meaning Moses, to tell you that I was commanded to tell. It's not that Adonai commanded all of this to tell, meaning that you, the Israelites, should go out and tell this. This is not about memorizing the list. This is about the commandment that God gave me, Moses, to then speak to you, the community. So he is simply trying to avoid any mistaken assumptions about the pronouns. Now, again, we may feel that it's obvious because we know from the rest of the Torah that this is not the kind of commandment that God would have given to tell the people to go forth and list all of the things that should be brought for the Mishkan. But Rashi wants to make sure that we do not make that mistake. Then in verse 5, whoever is of willing heart, because his heart prompts him to generosity, and again, remember, heart is not just your center of emotion, then he is called this nediv lev, that he is called this willingness of himself, one who is prompted to generosity by the heart. I guess you can make the joke in English, the hearty volunteer, a heartfelt volunteer, or a full self volunteer. I have already explained the various materials which form the contribution towards the tabernacle and the work done for it in the passages where the commands about them were given. So Rashi is very explicitly saying, we've already talked about all these things. I'm not going to repeat myself. Go back and check the earlier chapters. But there are a few things that do have to be mentioned nonetheless. And the next thing that gets mentioned is all the way down here in verse 11. The tabernacle, here in Fox being translated as the dwelling, or in general, as we often refer to it as the Mishkan. Well, Rashi is going to try and drive us to be a little bit more precise, because generally we use that term Mishkan very broadly to mean the entire project. But the tabernacle, the Mishkan, is the lower curtains, which were visible within the building. Those are called the Mishkan. But if we really want to talk about what was the actual Mishkan, then we have to say that it was that internal building itself. And then we have to remember that there was its tent from the next commentary of Rashi, and this is the covering of goat skins, which was made to serve as roofing. So you have a layer, an inner layer that is the Mishkan. Then you have a tent that goes around it that is made from the goat skin. And then you have the covering that goes over all of it. And that is the covering of ram skins and the tachash skins. And I've had classes before on tachash and what it means, what kind of exotic animal skin was being used as this outer structure. But Rashi here is not pointing on its identity, he's just pointing on its purpose. That we have the Mishkan as the innermost dwelling place, the innermost place where if you were inside the tent, this is what you would be seeing. And then we have around it a covering made out of that the goat skins. And then out of that, or around that, we have the actual rain cover that is protecting the entirety of it from the elements. So there are 3 layers, and you only see the Mishkan technically when you are on that inside level. If you were standing on the very far outside, well, technically you would not be looking at the Mishkan proper. But of course, like I mentioned, we still use the term Mishkan to mean the entire tabernacle and all of its structure as a collective unit. Just like when we talk about the temple in Jerusalem, usually we're not being so precise to be referring to only certain parts of it and certain elements of it. We're talking about the whole enterprise. And Rashi is trying to make that clear in case we got confused of how it made it sound like the Mishkan was a separate thing. So now we know. And then for verse 12. So here we're in verse 12, where it is talking about the parochet, the curtain for the screen, as Fox translates it. So this parochet, this curtain, the curtain means the curtain of that which serves for partitioning, right? Bringing in that phrase hamasach as the compound form of the word to help us understand what we mean by parochet in this context. Everything that screens an object, whether it hangs above or in front of, is called a masach or sechach as an alternative version. So, and then he gives us some additional references for these words found in Job and found in Hosea. So again, we're not going to trace down all of that language. That's fun to do. And as always, Sefaria makes it easy because it's only a click away. So please feed your curiosity. But he wants to make sure that we understand that this parochet hamasach is a curtain that is blocking. It is screening, as Fox does rightly translate, I think here, that is describing its purpose in what it's there for. It is meant to obscure so that we cannot see something behind it. Verse 13, let's get ourselves, oh, come on. Always goes just a bit more at the last second than you hope. So in verse 13, we mentioned the bread of presence, which is more commonly translated as shoe bread, which has always been my favorite translation ever, or show bread sometimes in more modern translations. But the Hebrew is lechem hapanim. And lechem panim is confusing in Hebrew too, as Rashi explains. I have already explained in Exodus 25:29 that it was so called because it had 2 faces turning in this direction and in that, because it was made like a case, open on 2 sides. So if you go back to 25:29, you can get more about this, but what he is basically saying is that the name is relatively mundane, that lechem panim is not anything about the presence, unlike what Fox is arguing here, but instead lechem panim is really just trying to say it's got 2 sides, more like a modern loaf that we're familiar with, as opposed to either a flatbread or a loaf that would just be sort of half of an ellipse. That lechem panim was really a double-faced loaf, that this is talking about the shape of the bread, not about its placing or function or really anything else. Now, that may be a little disappointing because certainly there's much to be said about Lechem Panim and its role and symbolism, but that doesn't mean its name itself has to be exciting. I can tell you from personal experience, both my own as well as that has been shared with me from other people, that sometimes when a person is beginning to learn Hebrew for the first time seriously, especially as an adult, they will be surprised by how mundane many of the beautiful Hebrew words that we use are, that when you translate them into English, now that you know what they mean, it can be a little disappointing. But you have to remember that the words were not chosen for their poetry. They were chosen as being simply appropriate. And sometimes the appropriate will have within it the embedded brilliance of poetic or linguistic turn of phrase. But sometimes it's just the most straightforward way to convey a particular idea or item. And that shouldn't be disappointing to us. It's and we shouldn't over worship the exoticness of things that are said in Hebrew that we don't understand as somehow being more thrilling because it sounds so foreign and evocative, and it must be spiritual because it's in Hebrew. The Hebrew is a mundane language as well. Yes, it is Lashon HaKodesh, it is the holy language, but it is also used for mundane things like tables, poles, and implements. And that is something that shouldn't shock us. So yes, continue to use the Hebrew and let it be evocative, but also don't be disappointed when it turns out that those evocative words are fairly mundane in the original language. And then let's pick up with 14. And as we saw in verse 14, it mentions this keleha, which is being translated here as its implements, and over here as its vessels. Well, Rashi wants us to understand that ambiguous term means the tongs and snuff dishes, that we should know what those are, that they were described earlier. So that would be just filling in the shorthand that the Torah has used here. And then continuing through the list on verse 14, it's lamps, that is to say, bowls into which the oil and wick were placed. That when we talk about lamps, this is the type of lamp we are talking about here. And then we get into the actual oil that was used for the lighting. This also required wise-hearted men in preparing it. And therefore, Scripture mentions it also after the statement from verse 10, and every wise-hearted man shall make. Remember, we had sort of a differentiation between some of the raw materials that could be brought and then things that would be brought that would be made with particular skill. For it was different from other oils, as it is mentioned in Menachot 86a. He let it, meaning the olives, ripen at the top of the olive tree, and thus the oil is beaten and yet clear as Scripture prescribes. So we are given our reference here that this oil was not like regular oil, which is something we discussed in our earlier class about the oil a couple weeks ago. I think it was a couple weeks ago. Sometimes my brain does funny tricks on me when it comes to the time scale. Okay. Oh, I just noticed, sorry, we rushed past verse 8 so fast that we didn't notice the simple phrase of Rashbam over here, where he is talking about the ketoret for the spices that you should, or for the incense that you shall bring various kinds of spices in order to prepare the incense. So he is trying to make sure that we understand precisely what that is being used for. But let's go ahead and pick up with verse 15 here with Rashi. Come on, one more. Nope, always goes two when I ask it for one. All right, so we are talking about this screen again, but this time we are talking about the Masach HaPetach, the screen at the opening or at the entrance. What does that mean? Well, the screen for the entrance, the curtain that was in front of the east side of the tabernacle, for there were neither boards nor curtains there. So the way the Mishkan was constructed, there was one end which was open, that was not part of the three main walls, but there was a curtain that the Kohanim would go through and enter into the Mishkan itself proper. And that's what this Masacha Petach is, that this is the entrance screen that is blocking the entranceway into the Mishkan itself. And then picking up with his commentary on verse 17, let's get that lined up, talking about the columns and its sockets. Well, here you just need to understand that although Amudav has a masculine and Adaneha has a feminine suffix, and thus Hatzer is used here, which is a masculine and feminine noun. Similar it is with many things. So he's pointing out that the so-called masculine and feminine nouns and adjectives and all the conjugation patterns and declination patterns that are found throughout Hebrew, along with many other languages as well. English is kind of weird for having no gender inflection, or very, very little gender inflection. Doesn't mean that everything is always going to appear perfectly consistent. Sometimes a word will take a masculine ending or a feminine ending, but that doesn't mean that we should think that the grammar is wrong. It is not that the Torah forgot how to conjugate or to get the agreement between the gender of the object and the gender of a noun and or of an adjective or a verb. It is because sometimes Hebrew is, well, you can't say inconsistent because it's consistent in the inconsistency, but sometimes it is not overly simplistic in how it applies the labels to different words. It's a very important aside. When I mentioned before about people learning Hebrew for the first time and sometimes being surprised, one of the other things that surprised many, myself included, was the fact that every object within the world has a gender in Hebrew. But what I came to understand is that the term gender means a very different thing within language than it does within society. Hebrew does not gender things because it is more masculine or feminine in a sociological sense. Hebrew genders things simply because ancient Semitic languages did that by default without any consideration to whether or not the object being gendered was more or less masculine in some cultural way. So objects are almost randomly given a gender, thanks to some ancient person who coined the phrase at a given time. And sometimes they made them irregular. So a quote masculine noun will take feminine prefixes or suffixes and vice versa. And we just have to accept that that's the phrase. But trying to create any cultural interpretation of why was this masculine, why was that feminine, is really a fool's errand. That the ubiquitous use of gendered language as seen globally has very little to do with how the society thought of an object as being more or less masculine. And of course, we should also, I hope, have the humility to recognize that any concept of femininity or masculinity from the ancient world is still quite foreign to us, and we should not be projecting our own beliefs about what is masculine, what is feminine into our past, and definitely not into the language itself. But then, of course, you can get the modern object of great humor whenever people complain and say, well, in the past, no one cared about gender. I'm sorry, everything's got a gender. They just don't mean it the way people think about gender these days. But if you don't think about gender, then you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to read Hebrew because it's all got a gender to one point or another, but it's a grammatical gender, not a cultural gender. Okay, Rashi also goes on in verse 17 to talk about the screen for the gate of the enclosure. And he says, the curtain, which was hanging on the east side, covering the 20 middle cubits in the width of the enclosure, which the latter was 50 cubits wide. Of this, 15 cubits on the north side was closed by hangings, and so too on the south side, as it is said, hangings on one side of the gate shall be 15 cubits, and on the other side shall be hangings 15 cubits. So these are the hangings of the screen that went around the courtyard. So in addition to the Mishkan itself, there in the heart of the tabernacle zone, there was also an outer fence, an outer wall, but cloth, that was around a larger courtyard area that screened off the tabernacle from just casual entry, and that was very important. But there was an entrance place, there was a gateway, if you will, that had this main covering that's being discussed here. As you can see, a lot of this, as I mentioned at the outset, it seems to be fairly unimportant. That, this is not life-altering information. This is not great moral insight. This is not important narrative development. We're not seeing the character of Moses or Aaron being reflected in some way that can inspire or instruct us. And that's okay. Our commentaries were not written purely so that we would have the right ideas about how to live our life on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, that's there. It was not written just so we would have the right ideas about our ancestors and what they did or didn't do, although that's there. The commentaries were written so that we would understand the Torah, even for passages like this, where I am in no position to recreate the Mishkan, and God forbid someone should try, beyond just a model or some sort of artistic representation, just as a inspirational image. And I shouldn't need to know this information, but the Torah did convey it. And if the Torah conveyed it, then I should at least be correct in my understanding of it. And thus the commentaries weigh in on trying to make sure that the image I get in my mind is as clear and correct as possible, even if it is not something that I am going to be building, even if it is not something that, if I were wrong about in my mind about what the Mishkan looked at, that I would make huge errors of judgment in my day-to-day life. Still, our commentaries are here to guide us for the entire Torah, not to say, skip these pages, they don't matter. Of course they matter, just they matter differently. All right, and verse 18, excuse me, there we are. The pins, right? The yitdot, the pins of the dwelling that were used for suspending things together. That is to say, these were the ones in order to insert them into the ground and to fasten thereby the edges of the curtains, that they should not be moved about by the wind. Again, seems very mundane, but it's important to understand that this wall of the Mishkan was not just looped, draped curtain, but that it was strung tightly, tautly to the ground and poles, and the cords to bind them with, that they were not decorative, that they had this important function to serve. And then verse 19, we get back to Rashbam again. I told you he didn't have much to say on this chapter. So in verse 19, where we are talking about these garments that are being worn for the officiating, well, Rashbam is saying that these are the garments that were made for to cover the various furnishings of the tabernacle during the periods the Israelites were traveling. And indeed, Rashi is also agreeing with that these special garments here were to cover up the ark, the table, the menorah, the candelabrum, just such a fancy English word, and the altars at the time of removing and packing up the articles in the tabernacle when they set out on their journeys. So this is one of those little details that is easy to miss when reading through, that the ark did not just get carried around this giant gleaming gold box in the middle of everyone, or even at the front, but that there was a special covering over it, and that these garments are separate from the garments that were worn by the Kohanim and by Aaron as well. That yes, there were clothes made for the high priest, and we get a lot of details about all of that, but there were also clothes made for the items of the tabernacle that they should be protected and covered when traveling. Because obviously, when the tabernacle was struck, broke down, and put into its traveling mode, the items in it would be exposed. But covering them would now make them much less exposed and certainly less vulnerable during the travel that they were about to undertake. All right, and I'm looking at our time, and before we jump into the next topic, I think we're going to go ahead and call it there for today. So just give a quick look over into the YouTube and see if anyone has any questions. I'm not seeing anybody typing there, and no one's unmuting or typing in Zoom. So that means we're going to go ahead and call it there. I think I've tried to stretch that out as long as possible to make up for the YouTube lag to allow anyone to ask a question. All right, then I will see everybody next week as we begin the book